The pale light of dawn seeped through the gaps in the curtains, casting an ethereal glow over the room. The scent of aged wood and dust hung in the air, a testament to the passage of time. Jacob's eyes fluttered open as his alarm clock let out a shrill, signaling the start of another day. Lying still for a moment, he attempted to pierce the fog that enveloped his mind, a fog born from the potent mix of medications he took to manage his mental health. With a deep sigh, he swung his legs over the side of bed and reached for the pill bottles on his nightstand. The assortment of psychoactive drugs, tranquilizers, and antipsychotics was a daily necessity, an essential part of his morning routine. Jacob mechanically swallowed each pill, feeling the familiar bitterness on his tongue as he steeled himself for the numbing effect they would have on his mind. Once the medication had taken effect, Jacob stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. The creak of the floorboards beneath his feet echoed in the stillness of the room. He glanced at the framed photos on the dresser, the images of his family a constant reminder of the life he once knew. His gaze lingered on the picture of his younger brother, Adam, a pang of concern gnawing at him as he thought about the boy's recent association with the local gang. Pushing the worry aside for now, Jacob made his way to the bathroom and turned on the shower. The sound of water droplets pattering against the tiles filled the space as he stepped under the warm spray. As the water cascaded over his body, the fragrant scent of soap mingling with the steam, his thoughts were consumed by the challenges that lay ahead, both at work and at home. After drying off and dressing, Jacob checked on his mother. The weight of responsibility for her care bore heavily on him, but it was a duty he accepted without question. He made sure she was comfortable and had everything she needed before heading to the small kitchen to prepare breakfast. He moved methodically, each step of the process executed with precision. The sound of eggs cracking against the pan's edge punctuated the quiet morning, followed by the sizzle of the frying pan filling the room. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as he sipped the steaming liquid, the bitter taste awakening his senses. As he ate, Jacob's mind was preoccupied with the challenges the day would bring and the ever-present battle to maintain control over his mental health. He glanced out the window, observing the world outside through the veil of his medicated mind, his experiences tinted by the haze of his medication. As Jacob completed his morning routine, he slipped on his worn jacket, the frayed edges bearing witness to its age. The door creaked softly as he stepped outside, and the crisp morning air filled his lungs with a refreshing chill. The journey to work was a blur, the world around him muted by the haze of medication. Arriving at the factory, he clocked in and began his daily tasks as a janitor, the whir of machinery and the scent of grease and metal permeating the air. Throughout his day, Jacob moved through the factory floor like a ghost, barely noticed by the bustling workers. He cleaned up spills and collected trash, the rhythmic sounds of his work blending into the factory's cacophony. The other employees occasionally exchanged glances or whispered about the strange janitor, but most were too busy with their own tasks to pay him much mind. Jacob's awkwardness at work was palpable. He avoided eye contact, his gaze often distant and unfocused as he went about his duties. Conversations were rare, and even simple greetings were met with little more than a nod or a mumbled acknowledgement. The haze of his medication left him disconnected from those around him, a solitary figure in the midst of the factory's chaos. As the day wore on, the new guy who had been at the factory for only a week couldn't help but notice Jacob's peculiar behavior. Intrigued and somewhat concerned, he approached Terry during their break and commented on the janitor's unkempt appearance and the unsettling way he avoided interacting with anyone. Terry listened intently, his expression turning serious as the new guy shared his observations. He knew there was more to Jacob than met the eye, and decided that it was time to share his story. As Terry and the new guy settled into their seats in the break room, The hum of the factory machines seemed to fade into the background. Terry took a deep breath, ready to share the story of that fateful night when his life had become intertwined with Jacob's. Terry began by describing the night he had been caught with another man's wife, the fury and betrayal in the husband's eyes as he and his friends cornered Terry in a dark alley behind a local bar. The pungent stench of stale beer and garbage filled the air as the sound of fists connecting with flesh echoed off the brick walls. Terry lay battered and bruised, beaten to within an inch of his life, when Jacob appeared. As Terry recounted the events of that night, the new guy listened with rapt attention, his eyes widening at each harrowing detail. Jacob emerged from the shadows, his face set in a grim expression. He moved with the precision and speed of a trained predator, quickly closing the distance between him and the attackers. Terry watched in a mixture of awe and horror as Jacob took on the assailants one by one. The first attacker barely had time to register Jacob's presence before a devastating punch to the solar plexus sent him crumpling to the ground, the wind knocked out of him. The second attacker swung a wild punch at Jacob, who effortlessly ducked and countered with a swift elbow to the man's temple, rendering him unconscious. The husband and his remaining friend hesitated, realizing the formidable opponent they now faced. Jacob lunged at the third attacker, expertly twisting the man's arm behind his back, the sound of the joint popping out of its socket filling the alley. The man screamed in pain before collapsing to the ground. Finally, Jacob turned his attention to the husband, who was visibly shaken by the display of violence. In a matter of seconds, Jacob closed the gap between them and delivered a powerful kick to the husband's knee, the sickening crunch of shattering bone echoing through the alley. The man crumpled in agony, and Jacob, having neutralized each attacker, glanced over his shoulder at Terry, seemingly evaluating his condition. After a few moments of staring at Terry, Jacob pulled his keys out of his pocket, studied them for a few seconds, and then walked away, heading towards his truck, leaving Terry lying there in pain. When Terry eventually returned to work after a long hospital stay, he tried multiple times to thank Jacob, but the enigmatic janitor remained distant, his eyes always clouded by the haze of medication. Fueled by curiosity and gratitude, Terry began investigating Jacob like an obsessive stalker for weeks, Googling, spying on him, and following him. The second time Terry followed Jacob, the janitor somehow managed to lose him. When Terry returned to his own truck, he found Jacob sitting there in his vehicle. As Terry approached, Jacob drove away, leaving Terry with even more questions about the mysterious man who had saved his life. Jacob methodically checked his cleaning cart for the last time, ensuring that everything was in its proper place. With a final glance around the factory floor, he decided that his work for the day was done. He walked towards the exit, his gait slow and purposeful, his eyes taking in every detail of his surroundings. As he climbed into his old truck, he couldn't help but feel the constant hum of thoughts and calculations in his mind. It was as if his brain was constantly scanning, analyzing, and filing away every piece of information. The truck's engine roared to life, and he began the drive home. The road stretched before him, a seemingly endless expanse of asphalt. Jacob's keen eyes flicked from the rearview mirror to the side mirrors, taking note of every vehicle that passed him, the make and model, and the faces of the drivers. His mind buzzed with information, the number of cars on the road, their speed, the distance between them, and the probability of an accident. As he continued to drive, he started to hear faint whispering. At first, it was barely audible, like a distant breeze rustling through the trees. But as he drove on, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They were negative, spiteful words, designed to cut through him and shake him to his core. The whispers escalated, and Jacob's thoughts began to spiral. Suddenly, the hallucination shifted from auditory to visual. Along the side of the highway, He saw people appearing sporadically, some staring at him with intense, piercing gazes, while others walked aimlessly, seemingly unaware of his presence. His heart raced as he struggled to differentiate between reality and the haunting images his mind was creating. Then, suddenly, one of the figures slowly stepped out in front of his truck, forcing Jacob to swerve onto the shoulder and slam on the brakes. His breathing was heavy, and sweat dripped from his brow. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the hallucination from his mind. As the seconds ticked by, the voices and the figures gradually disappeared, leaving him alone in the cab of the truck. The sounds of the highway became a distant murmur as he focused on his breathing, willing his heart rate to return to normal. The medication he took to manage his schizophrenia usually helped, but sometimes the hallucinations still broke through, as real and terrifying as ever. With a final shuddering breath, Jacob opened his eyes and carefully looked around. The road was clear and the hallucination had passed. He knew he needed to get home, to the familiar surroundings that brought him some semblance of peace. He shifted the truck into gear, merged back onto the highway, and continued his journey, the noise in his mind a little quieter now, but never truly gone. As Jacob pulled into the driveway of their modest home, he immediately noticed something amiss. Through the living room window, he caught sight of his younger brother, Adam, sitting on the couch, a glass of beer in hand. Two unfamiliar faces, both bearing the unmistakable tattoos of the local gang, were with him. Adam was a complicated teenager, a moody artist who seemed to find solace in sad music and gothic imagery. The rift between the brothers had widened after Adam's suicide attempt last year, which had left Jacob even more detached and focused solely on their mother's well-being. Little did Jacob know that Adam had spiraled further into darkness, now addicted to heroin and indebted to a local drug dealer. As Jacob stepped out of his truck and approached the front door, his mind began calculating the potential risks that these gang members posed to his mother. If their presence threatened her safety or well-being, he would intervene without hesitation. He entered the house, his face expressionless, as he surveyed the scene before him. Adam glanced up from the couch, his eyes narrowed and resentful, while the gang members looked Jacob up and down, sizing him up. "Hey, Jacob," Adam sneered. "I was just showing my new friends some of my art. They really appreciate it, unlike some people." He gestured towards the gang members, who smirked in agreement. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy as Jacob stood there, his gaze fixed on his younger brother. Adam's eyes held a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. His fists clenched tightly on his lap. Adam braced himself for a confrontation, but instead, Jacob's voice came out unnervingly calm. "Adam, I need you to leave the room for a moment," Jacob said, his eyes never leaving the gang members. Adam hesitated, then shook his head. Jacob's gaze hardened. "This is not a request. Leave, now." Adam glared at his brother, but reluctantly got up and left the room. As soon as Adam was out of sight, Jacob turned his attention to the gang members. His expression was unreadable, and his voice was devoid of emotion. "You have two choices," Jacob said coldly. "You can leave this house now and never come back, or you can find out what happens if you stay." The gang members exchanged nervous glances, sensing that Jacob wasn't someone to be messed with. They stood up, muttered their goodbyes to Adam, and left the house without another word. Once they were gone, Jacob went to find Adam. He discovered him in his bedroom, hunched over a sketchbook, angrily scribbling away. Jacob hesitated at the doorway, unsure how to approach his brother. "Adam," he began, but Adam cut him off. "Save it," Adam spat. "I know you don't care about me. You never have." Jacob paused, trying to process his brother's words. He knew Adam was right. He didn't feel empathy or affection like others did, but he also knew that he had a duty to protect his family. "I may not understand or feel things the way you do, Adam, Jacob said, his voice steady. "But I want to keep you and Mom safe. That's my responsibility." Adam looked up from his sketchbook, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Well, you have a damn funny way of showing it." Jacob sighed, unsure how to respond. "We need to get you away from that drug dealer and the gang. I'll help you, but you need to be honest with me about everything." Adam hesitated, then nodded slowly. As they sat down together to discuss the situation, a tenuous connection began to form between the two brothers, each trying to navigate the unfamiliar territory of their relationship. And for Jacob, this marked the first step toward grappling with the complexities of human emotion and the importance of forging a connection with those he was sworn to protect. Jacob studied his brother as Adam hesitated, clearly struggling with whether or not to reveal information about Shotzi. After a few moments, Adam finally spoke up, his voice barely audible. "Shotzi. He's dangerous, Jacob. Really dangerous." Jacob listened closely, his eyes never leaving Adam's face as his brother hesitantly shared what he knew. Shotzi was a feared man, a 25-year-old obsessive bodybuilder with an evident case of OCD, which only served to make him more meticulous and paranoid. He was said to enjoy torturing his victims and held dogfights in a nearby warehouse. Shotzi had killed several men, some of whom he had tortured, cooked, and eaten. He was obsessed with knives and death and ran a small faction of a larger gang that dealt mainly in heroin. Adam admitted that he had never met Shotzi personally, but knew that it was ultimately this man that he owed money to. As Jacob absorbed this information, he felt a chill run down his spine. This was not a man to be taken lightly. But still, he couldn't just sit by and let his brother suffer. Finally, after Adam had shared all that he knew, Jacob stood up, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to talk to Shotzi. I'll do what I can to settle this peacefully." Adam stared at him, fear and disbelief etched on his face. "Jacob, are you crazy? You can't just walk up to someone like Shotzi and expect everything to be fine. He's a monster." Jacob hesitated, knowing that his brother's fears were well-founded. "I don't know, Adam. I have to try." With that, Jacob left the house, his resolve unwavering as he headed toward Shotzi's place. He knew that the odds were against him, but he couldn't sit idly by and let his brother be consumed by this dangerous world. It was his duty as a brother to protect Adam, even if it meant facing a man as terrifying as Shotzi. As Jacob walked, his mind raced with thoughts of how to approach the situation. He knew that he would have to be cautious and calculated. But one thing was certain: he would do everything in his power to protect his mother and subsequently Adam. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the quiet suburban street. Shotzi's white, two-story house stood out among the others, with its neatly trimmed hedges and a shiny '67 muscle car parked in the driveway. He was washing the car with meticulous care, his muscular arms glistening from the combination of sweat and water. As a high-ranking member of the white supremacist gang, the Peckerheads, Shotzi was a force to be reckoned with, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. His cold, piercing eyes scanned his surroundings for any sign of threat, his paranoia always keeping him on high alert. Jacob approached him cautiously, but without fear, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. His eyes were locked on Shotzi, analyzing every detail about the man who posed a danger to his family. "I need to talk to you about my brother, Adam," he said, getting straight to the point. Shotzi looked up, his cold eyes sizing up Jacob. A sneer formed on his lips as he took in Jacob's unkempt appearance. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Have you lost your mind?" "I'm Adam's brother," Jacob replied firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know he owes you money, and I want to figure out how we can settle his debt." Shotzi studied Jacob for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He carefully placed the sponge he was using to wash his car on the hood and crossed his arms over his broad chest. "You got some nerve coming here like this," he said. "But I guess it takes guts to face me. Your brother owes me $5 grand. Can you handle that?" Jacob hesitated for a moment, knowing he didn't have that kind of money. "I can't pay you that right now," he admitted. "I make minimum wage as a janitor, but I can pay you back overtime, or maybe we can work something out." Shotzi looked Jacob up and down, sizing him up. His nostrils flared as he considered the offer. The silence that followed was heavy with tension, the air thick with the scent of car wax and the underlying threat of violence. "Finally," he said, "I'll give you and your brother some time to come up with the money, but it better be soon. If not, you'll be dealing with me directly. And trust me, you don't want that." Jacob, well aware of Shotzi's dangerous reputation and his own capabilities, met his gaze without flinching. "I understand," he replied, his voice cold and emotionless. Both men knew that this agreement was not to be taken lightly, and their resolve to protect their own interests was unwavering. As Jacob turned to leave, Shotzi called out, "Remember, I don't do second chances. You better keep your word." Jacob didn't look back, but the weight of the threat hung heavily on his shoulders as he walked away from Shotzi's house, determined to find a way to save his brother from a potentially deadly situation.